Thought I'd do something a little bit different today. I often see videos and conversations and podcasts and a lot of content based on distributions themselves and what new releases there are and what is interesting about new desktop environment versions and stuff like that. I don't often hear about how people are using their desktops, what they do with Linux, and how maybe they're using it in a professional way or something like that. So what I wanted to talk about today was how I use Linux for developing websites. In particular, one of the things I do is local development environments. So the idea of being able to create essentially a personal local web server to host your project as you're building it. And this is interesting and useful whenever you are just starting a project and it's easier to just have access to all of the systems directly and not have to deal with uploading files somewhere or any of that. So I've been using Docker to do this for a while, and I found a nice tool set that lets me use Docker, but also gives me some configurability and controls on deploying websites and some things like that. So I wanted to sort of, like I said, make this a combination of me using Linux and how I'm using it in a professional sense, and then also the thing I'm doing, which is this local Docker, WP local Docker tool. WP local Docker, it's as the name would imply, it's a Docker tool, Docker environment, and basically what it does is lets you very easily create and manage local WordPress installations, and they are created as Docker containers and kept separate from each other so that they are portable and don't interfere with each other. And you can also spin up as many as you need in order to test something. So this is great, and the intent of it is that you install it locally on your computer and then just use this as your development environment. The problem with that for someone like me who's a serial distro hopper or who's switching between a multi-boot system and booting into one environment and then another. So the challenge of trying to keep your systems synchronized can be a bit of a headache. And so it occurred to me, well, I could install this same tool onto a virtual machine and then just have that virtual machine be where it lives, and it's easy to start that virtual machine from any desktop environment, from any instance of an install of Linux, even Windows or anything else. I mean, VirtualBox or whatever your preferred virtualization tool, generally those will run on multiple systems. So I tried this out about a week ago and it works really well. There's a couple extra steps that are beyond the instructions that they give you here, but it's nothing tremendously difficult, and I just wanted to run through it real quick and just put it out there as an idea for people in case you are looking for a solution like this, and just to let you know that it's been working well for me. All right, so I just kind of went through the overview already. The setup is essentially installing VirtualBox or your preferred virtual machine manager, which I already have VirtualBox installed, so I don't have to actually go through that step, but that's what you'd have to do if you don't already have it. You'd want to install, I'm going to use Ubuntu Server 1804 or whatever your preferred server distro. It doesn't have to be a server distro, it could be anything, but Linux-based is better. And then you'd configure the server for remote access, and that means not only accessing the website itself once you've created the instance of WordPress, but also the way you're going to do this is instead of working in the virtual machine window, you're going to be going through SSH through the terminal. So we want to configure that so that we can do all the things we need to do there. Then we'll install and configure WordPress local Docker, and then finish up by creating and accessing a WordPress installation. All right, so let's go with the first step, and I am going to just cut out a lot of the parts where it's just things installing and processing so that this video doesn't take like 2 hours. So our first step here is to just go ahead and create a new VM. I'm going to say Ubuntu local web server. Why not? You really don't need a ton of memory for web servers, especially if you're only running a handful, at a time. You can have dozens on the system, but unless they're actively running the containers, it's not going to use up a lot of memory. So honestly, 2 gigs of RAM should be plenty. And, websites aren't that big, so I'm just going to go ahead and give it about 25 gigs of hard disk space. So let's go ahead and we'll give it some processors here. That helps. And we don't really even have to worry about display at all because we're actually going to run this headless. And we want to say Ubuntu or live server, and that should be all we need. Get started. And for those of you who've never installed it this way, this is actually, I really enjoy this installation method, and it's very similar to Ubiquity in terms of the choices it offers you and the steps that you go through. But because it's server based, it has a couple extra things like installing, you can install some server snaps and some things like that. So it's actually pretty interesting to run through if you've never installed server. And networking, proxy address, mirror address, and I'm just going to use the entire disk. And we'll say Ubuntu web server. Why not? Ubuntu password. Definitely want OpenSSH server. Don't have anything to import. They're done. Now see, this is where you can throw in some snaps if you need. We're running everything through Docker, so we don't really need any software on here except for Docker, which we will install after this. And I'm going to go ahead and let this run through, and I'll be back when it's done. All right, so it's all done installing. We'll go ahead and reboot. It says remove the installation media in the virtual machine. You just hit enter. It ejects it itself. And it's going to come back up. And because it's all right, we use our login that we created. And 9 packages can be updated. So let's just go ahead and do that and get it out of the way. Okay. Make it bigger. All right, so let's see what the IP is. Actually, I forgot one step, so I'm going to go ahead and just shut down here. Oh, it's not going to hurt it. In order to have access to the virtual machine, you have to change the networking. So under network, instead of NAT, which is the default, I'm going to do bridged. And what that'll allow is that I can actually get to this machine will get an actual IP address on my local network, and then I can access that machine. You can do host only networking, except then that machine won't have access to the internet. So if you needed to run updates, and part of the WP local Docker is pulling down the container images and all that stuff. So you kind of have to use bridged. So okay, now that that's set to bridged, when it starts back up, it's going to get a valid IP on my network. So once I log in here, because Ubuntu is awesome, it will show me the IP that I'll need to connect to with SSH. And I'm also going to set up a private key so that I don't need to, I'm sorry, I'm going to set up key-based SSH so I don't need to put in the password every time. All right, so it's telling me here, here's my IP address, 161. So let's go up and make sure we can SSH into that. It'll be Ubuntu at 92.86.61.160. There we go. Log in. And all right, so we're essentially looking at the same thing just from SSH. So what I'm going to do now is, since I'm in here, I don't need to see this anymore. So I'm just going to get this out of the way and just use the terminal. All right, so you know what, just for the sake of the length of this video, I don't see a reason to show the setting up the key. So that's something that it's not too difficult to figure out how to do. And the thing it saves you is that you don't have to type in your password, which isn't that big of a deal. So I'm going to start a screen session. And basically, if you don't know what screen is, screen creates a session on the remote host that you can detach from and then reattach to, and it basically leaves it in the state you were in. So if you don't do that, basically once you kill your SSH session, you lose all of the history of that session. And if there was a process running, that kind of thing, it's better to have that screen where you can connect in. So all right, so I'm going to follow the instructions for installing Docker. So under the installation, come down to Linux. We're going to follow the documentation there, and there. Let's do Docker first. And we want to click Ubuntu. And then this is essentially just copying and pasting. I know that's not always a great idea, but this is a trusted source, and I've done this 24 times. So I know that these commands are safe, and I'm also reading them as I copy and paste them. So it's not like I'm just doing it without, paying attention to what I'm doing. So, all right, so Docker is not installed. That was the purpose of that, is to, if there was a version of Docker installed, they don't want you to have a conflict. And so now we're going to set the repository, right, get the key, and you can check the fingerprint. I'm not going to, just for the sake of time on this. And we want the AMD64 repo, so I'm just going to go ahead and copy this and paste it. And then we want to do apt update and then install these packages. So update and that command. And then let's see, there's one last thing. Once it's all installed, we'll run the hello world just to make sure it's working. Pulls it down, says that it is working. Great. And the last thing is a convenience thing where you can add your user to the Docker group. Don't ever do this in production. Like if you're running a Docker server somewhere, adding a regular user to this Docker group essentially gives them permissions to much more of the system than you would ever want. So this is literally a local environment in a local machine. There's zero chance that it's going to be, a security risk. So that's why they even include it here. They clearly say that you should avoid doing that. So my user does not exist. And you can either use your username or just $user. And then this will not take effect until I end this session and log back in. All right, so that's Docker. Now we want to do compose. And compose is really easy because you're essentially just downloading a file and then setting the executable bit on it. And Docker compose version. There you go. All right, so that's working. And the last piece is Node. We want Debian and Ubuntu. We follow the instructions for the Debian and Ubuntu based distributions. There's official binaries available. Takes you to another page, and then you essentially scroll down, and then there is a repo to add. We want 12, and that's going to install. And that'll be our last part before we actually come. And then the last piece is to actually just do the npm install of WP local Docker, which I have to do as root or as sudo. Doesn't tell you that, but you do. Okay, so now that is everything installed. Now that everything's installed, we can go ahead and run through some of the 10up commands here. And actually, that's not true. I want to go ahead and I need to exit first. So that terminated the screen, and then I got to exit again and then go back in. And then I want to screen again. And now we can run 10up, and we want to do configure. It's a little bigger. And we'll just leave this as the default. So this is the local users, the server users home folder, and that's fine. They have a snapshots tool that I really haven't used, but it's something that they include. And I think it would be handy eventually if I need it. And do you want it to manage your host file? So one of the ways that it helps you is by mapping a domain to the IP address, to the server itself, so that you can have multiple domains. So each site has a domain essentially, and it can manage that for you. In this case, that's not going to work because the way that's doing that is by writing it to your local hosts file, and then that DNS, that translation, the lookup is happening on your local machine. That server is not local now. So when I said at the beginning of this that it'd be a little bit different than the WP local Docker method or description of doing it, this is one of those ways. So this convenient part of this is not going to be something that we can use. So I'm actually going to say no here. All right, now that that's configured, we can do WP, nope, 10up Docker create. So I'm going to create a new one here. And what is the primary host name for your site? And I'm going to say 10up test or 10up.test. Additional domains, no proxy. And this is nice. So if you have need of different versions of PHP, which, you might be running a site that for whatever reason, there are plugins or something that needs an older version of PHP, you can do that. I always try to run the latest version because it tends to be the most performant. I don't need Elasticsearch. Do I want to install WordPress? Yes. Do I want a single site, multi-site, or a core development version? So I'm going to do single site, remove the content, the default content of the test page and the test post and the Akismet and Hello Dolly plugins and all that. So that's the default content that it will remove. You have another option. You have another chance to change the site name if, I'm sorry, you can say, this is where you can set the name of the site. So I'm going to say 10up test like that instead of change your admin name, username, password if you want, email. And now what it's going to do is go out and actually pull down all of the Docker components that it needs. So these are all the individual containers, and you see there's going to be a web server. So this is the Nginx proxy. There's going to be a MySQL container, all the things it needs to create the server environment to run a full environment for a website. This takes a little while, so I'm going to let that run sort of in the background and just talk about one other thing here. So you notice that it asked about the admin email. One of the problems usually with running local environments, unless you've taken the time to set up things like a mail catcher or PHP MyAdmin or some of the other tools that make life easier, it's just extra work. And that's one of the reasons that I appreciate what 10up did here with this tool, is that it gives you the tools built in. So PHP MyAdmin's built in, mail catcher, there's a memcache, debug, you can hook into VS Code. So they've really made a nice set of tools here that is those all, in one environment. The other thing that's nice is they include the WP CLI, which if you build WordPress websites, this is a really interesting and helpful tool, because essentially you can run terminal commands against a WordPress installation and do things like installing themes, activating themes, plugins, clearing the cache, adding users, resetting passwords. Basically, almost everything you can do through the admin backend, you can do through the command line. Even things like regenerating thumbnails, which is something that happens from time to time if you need to change image sizes. And normally you'd have to get like a plugin to go and do that. And WP CLI just makes that like painless. So the fact that that's in here is awesome. You can also do, get in through the shell for the various components, the containers themselves, as well as looking at logs and things. So again, just a really comprehensive tool. And so 10up, the thing with 10up is they are a pretty large, they're huge web development studio that does a lot on WordPress. And so this is just an open sourced tool that they use, that they developed in-house to make their own workflow faster and more efficient. So we all benefit from their expertise, which is amazing. So this does take, like I said, this takes a long time because it's going to go and has to pull all of that stuff. And so I'm just going to go ahead and pause it here, and then I'll pick it back up whenever this is done. All right, so that's all done now. And what we do now, so that the part I was talking about where the local hosts file would have changed and would have let you just run this. So if this was on my computer here, I could have just gone straight to the site and been done with it. But there's one extra step now because of this being another system. I have to actually do the host's configuration on my local machine pointing to that server. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to name this thing Ubuntu web server. All right, so I need to edit my own host file. And I've already got a different one in here because this is, I'd already had this set up. So I just ran back through this again. So I'm essentially doing the same exact thing you can see that's already there, but I'm just doing it for another server. And that was 161. And then I'm going to do cut and uncut just a couple times, and we want to do, what was it, 10up.test. So we've pointed not only to the host itself, and the host, you don't really need to do that. You only need the one that's the .test. The reason I did the host is now the next time I go to connect to that machine, I don't have to use the IP. I can just use the host name. So I'll show you that. So let me go ahead and save that. Now, if I come to my browser, I can go to 10up.test, and it says nothing found, but this is the default install of that WordPress website. So if I go to WP admin, and it's admin password by default, you can see, it takes me in. And if you have ever done any local WordPress development, you can see that this is actually pretty fast. If you run local servers and stuff on a desktop class machine, sometimes they can be really painful and sluggish to deal with. And so this is actually very performant. It works really well. And so it's a great all around tool, like I said. All right, so that's all the steps. There was just one more thing I figured while we're here, I'll just go ahead and show, and I'll link to this page in the video description so you can get to it. So dealing with environments. So you saw me use create. You can delete, you can start and stop. So that's actually probably the most important thing. Let me show you that. So this is back on the server. If you remember, it created this local Docker sites directory. So if I go in there now, you're going to see the 10up, not ls, cd, would be better. Now you're going to see there's the 10up test, and if we look in there, that's where our actual files are. The WordPress folder is where all of the WordPress files live, and the config file. So when you shut down the server, you're going to need to, and you start it back up at some point, you're going to need to start the environments back up. So the environments won't be running, and you can either from within the specific folder. So if I went into 10up test, you can do Docker or 10up Docker. I will get this right. 10up Docker, stop and start. So in this case, because I'm not in the folder, I'm going to say stop and then 10up, and you can tab complete. It's going to go ahead and stop that. And you see it's just shutting down these are all the containers that it's using: Nginx, Memcache, PHP, All right, so now that site is stopped, so if I come back here and try to refresh this, it's going to say unavailable. And if I needed to start it, it would be the same thing with just the start command. And I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then the last thing I want to show you, just because it's so cool, and if you haven't ever seen it, you really should, is, where the heck did it go? There it is. All right, so 10up Docker WP is the shortcut for that, and I just create an alias for it so that I don't have to deal with that. So I just say alias equals, or alias WP CLI equals 10up Docker WP and space, that I don't have to. No, I don't need the space. So now if I go into, you have to go into the site itself. So I'm going to go into 10up test, and if I do WP CLI theme, I think it's list. Yeah, so it's going to show me the themes that are there, and you can do this for anything. Plugins, users, WP plugin list. And what's cool about this is if it will actually pull from the WordPress plugins website. So if you know what your plugin is called, you can say, I think it's add. No, actually it's install. And there's one I like called duplicator, so I'll go ahead and do that. And see, it knows to go out to the WordPress site. It's going to install the plugin, and then I can enable it from here as well. And then you'll see when I go into the back end, enable duplicate. Oh, it was enable. So they give you the help there as well. So WP CLI help plugin. I thought it was enable. Activate. Why? All right, cool. So now, like I said, if we go back in here and refresh and come over to plugins, our plugin is installed. So it's kind of like magic. It really is. If you've only ever been able to administer a site through the backend UI, it can be just painful and slow, and you have to wait for all the page refreshes and all that stuff. Whereas being able to do it like this is just, it's incredible. And there is a ton of stuff you can do in here. If you don't specify an option, you can see there's, from cache to config, you can export stuff, import stuff. You can, it's just on and on and on. Pretty much everything you can do in the back end, like I said, you can do here. So anyway, not to belabor the point, just if you're interested in WordPress, you administer WordPress at all, and you are technically minded and enjoy it, this concept that I just showed you, I have to believe that something like this would be interesting to you and benefit you. So worth taking a few minutes to look at it. All right, so the gist of this was then that, I'm using this excellent tool from 10up, and the problem I've had with it is because I install it on one single environment or instance, and then I end up distro hopping, and then it's like, well, now I have to move all those folders around and re-import them and all this stuff. And so it's just, for me, being who I am and the way I am with my computer, it's just so much easier to have it now in this virtual machine, because this machine now just lives with me, and I can take it wherever I want and use it wherever I want and just fire it back up. It is possible that the IP address might change, and of course you're gonna have to modify the host files on the different machines. So it's not completely seamless, but this at least saves you all the heavy lifting of, once you've got a site installed and configured and you're working on it, to be able to easily move that around. So there you go. Hopefully this was interesting. It's a little different from what I've been doing. No idea if the people who are subscribed to me right now will find this interesting, but like I said, the premise being that this is one of the ways that I'm using Linux in a real sort of productive way, besides just enjoying using it and playing around with it. And just it's so powerful, just the idea that I can do all these things through the terminal, and I've got SSH and just all these tools that just make life so much easier. Whereas when I was trying to do this in Windows or trying to do this on Mac, Mac's a little easier, but Windows was, you can get Commander, you can get some GitHub terminal, stuff like that, but it's just not the same. If you want a smooth experience and you're working with web technology at all, Linux is definitely the place to be. So, all right, with that, thanks for checking out the video. Any questions, comments, anything like that, please leave them below, and I will see you in the next one.